The late afternoon sun poured golden light through the high windows of the old storage room at the back of Rosefield Orphanage. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, dancing in slow motion with every small movement Emily made as she sorted through cardboard boxes stacked high against the walls. She was supposed to be helping clear out the back area for repainting, but her curiosity had led her deeper into the forgotten corner of the room. 13-year-old Emily wasn't like the other kids at the orphanage. While most of them had adapted to the rhythms of daily life, school, chores, mealtime, lights out, Emily often drifted through the day with a distant look in her eyes, as though she were always listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. She tugged at a box labeled Archives, 2012, its corners crushed with age. As she lifted the lid, the sharp scent of old paper and wood glue wafted up. Inside were scattered documents, yellowed sheets of newsprint, faded name tags, and beneath them all, a worn, leather-bound photo album. Curious, Emily flipped through the pages. Most of the photographs were unremarkable. Group shots of kids long gone, smiling teachers, seasonal decorations. But near the back, pressed beneath a wrinkled plastic sleeve, was one picture that made her breath catch. It showed a boy, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on a sunlit patch of grass. His arms were wrapped tightly around a pitbull puppy with sleek, silvery gray fur. The boy's smile was wide, eyes shining with unfiltered joy. But it was the dog's expression that struck Emily the most. The pitbull's eyes, dark, reflective, and impossibly vivid even through the faded photograph, seemed to pierce straight through the years and into her. There was something alert in that gaze, something intelligent and warm, loyal, watchful, and familiar. Emily found herself frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the page, the other hovering near her chest. Her heart had started beating faster, not in fear, but something stranger. A kind of ache bloomed in her chest, like hearing a melody you almost recognize but can't quite place. She leaned in closer, squinting. Around the dog's neck was a slim metal collar. On its tag, though partly worn, she could still make out the name, Buddy. Below the name was a tiny symbol etched into the metal, something like a wing or feather, perhaps a bird. A chill crept over her arms. She didn't know this boy. She didn't know this dog. And yet, she did. She had no memory of ever owning a dog or knowing anyone named Buddy. But there was something about that name, that silvery coat, those gentle yet alert eyes that refused to let go of her. Emily carefully slid the photograph out of its sleeve and held it up to the window. The late light caught on the creases and gave the image a strange glow. The boy's face was a blur from years of handling, but the dog, Buddy, looked untouched by time. The longer she stared at it, the more it felt like the dog wasn't just in the picture but looking right at her, imploring her, waiting. She swallowed hard. It was just a picture, she told herself, a forgotten moment from years ago. A boy and his dog, probably long gone, but her feet remained rooted to the floor. Her fingers didn't let go of the photo. "Hey, Em!" a voice called from outside the storage room. It was Janelle, one of the older girls. "You're gonna miss dinner!" Emily didn't answer. She gently tucked the photo into her sweater pocket and closed the album. That night, long after lights out, Emily lay awake in her bunk, the photo pressed beneath her pillow. She stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the image from her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that dog's face, those knowing eyes. She felt, no, she knew. This wasn't just a photo someone had left behind. This picture was a clue, a message, a beginning, and tomorrow she would start asking questions. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that had crept into her chest the night before. It was still there, resting just under the surface, like a thread gently pulling her toward something she couldn't yet see. As the other kids bustled through breakfast and prepared for the day's chores, Emily stayed quiet, the photo of the boy and the silvery pit bull tucked safely in her back pocket. By mid-morning, she slipped away from the group and made her way down the west hallway, one few of the younger kids ever bothered to explore. At the very end, past the dusty old piano and the broken vending machine, was a small office with a frosted glass door. The placard beside it read, Ms. Helen, Records and Archive. Ms. Helen was one of the oldest staff members at Rosefield. She had been around since, well, forever, according to the other kids. Most thought of her as a quiet woman with a soft voice and a fondness for yarn and lemon tea. But Emily knew better. There was something about Ms. Helen, something in her faraway gaze when she stared out the window too long, that suggested she remembered more than she let on. Emily hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in," came the gentle voice from inside. The office was filled with the scent of lavender and paper. Boxes were stacked neatly around the room, and the walls were lined with framed photos from decades past. Ms. Helen sat behind her desk, knitting something in a deep blue color. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Emily, dear, what brings you in here?" Emily walked in slowly, then held out the photo. "I found this in one of the old storage boxes. Do you know who they are?" Ms. Helen took the picture with careful hands. Her eyes studied it for a long moment, and for a heartbeat, Emily thought maybe she was mistaken. Maybe this woman didn't know anything after all. But then Ms. Helen's fingers began to tremble. "Oh my," she whispered. "I haven't seen this in years." "You do know them," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Helen nodded slowly. She set the photo on her desk, smoothing it flat. "That's Nathan," she said. "He was one of ours. Quiet boy, always looking out for others. And that beautiful pup." Her voice caught. "That's Buddy, the pit bull, one of the gentlest dogs I've ever known." Emily sat down without being asked. Her heart was racing. What happened to them? For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Finally, Ms. Helen spoke. "There was a fire," she said softly. "It happened one winter night about 8 years ago. Nobody ever figured out how it started. It spread fast, too fast. We lost part of the West Wing and 3 of the children went missing in the chaos. Nathan, Buddy, and—" Her voice faded and her eyes filled with tears. "His little sister. We thought they might have escaped somehow, but no one ever found them." Emily's mouth went dry. "They were never found? Not even Buddy?" Ms. Helen shook her head. "There were stories. A dog matching Buddy's description was seen a few towns over, but it was never confirmed. Eventually, people stopped looking. Grief does that to people, I suppose. But I never forgot them. Especially that dog. He was loyal to a fault." Emily stared at the photo, her mind spinning. "The little sister? No one knew what happened to her?" "No," Ms. Helen said, eyes still distant. "She vanished, just like Nathan." Emily felt the room tilt ever so slightly beneath her. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the chair. "What if Buddy's still out there?" she asked. "What if he never stopped trying to protect them?" Ms. Helen looked at her sharply, a strange light flickering in her eyes. "Why do you ask, Emily?" I just feel like I know him," Emily admitted. "Like I've seen him before. Not just in the photo, but somewhere deeper." There was a long pause. Ms. Helen studied her carefully. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a page with a handwritten note. "This was left by one of the volunteers who used to help after the fire," she said. "He said someone reported seeing a gray pit bull with a strange collar wandering near the woods outside of Eastfield, 2 weeks after the fire." "Eastfield?" Emily repeated. "That's only 30 miles from here." Ms. Helen nodded. "It's a long shot, but maybe it's not nothing." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily could barely focus during classes, her mind too busy imagining where a dog like Buddy might have gone, and how she could possibly find him after all this time. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the photograph clutched in her hand under the blanket. What if he really was still alive? What if he'd been out there, waiting for someone to come looking? Emily knew it sounded impossible, but something inside her, something fierce and stubborn, wouldn't let the thought go. The next morning, she returned to Ms. Helen's office with a map she'd borrowed from the library, a notebook, and a pencil. "I want to start looking," she said quietly. "Even if it's just one town at a time." Ms. Helen didn't smile this time, but she nodded. And for the first time in years, she reached across the desk, took Emily's hand, and squeezed it. "Then let's find Buddy." The old fire station sat at the edge of town like a forgotten relic. Its red paint had long since faded to a dusty brick, and the sign that once read Rosefield Volunteer Fire Department was now half covered in ivy. Emily stood at the front steps, her heart pounding beneath her jacket. In her hand, she held the photo of Buddy and the boy, Nathan. The edges had curled slightly from how often she had held it. Ms. Helen had told her about a man named Joe, retired now, but once one of the first responders during the fire that changed everything. He still came by the old station now and then, she said, to tend to the community garden behind it. Emily found him there, crouched in the dirt beside a patch of tomatoes. He was older than she expected, white hair, broad shoulders that had begun to curve inward with time, but his hands were steady, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were sharp. "You lost, sweetheart?" he asked kindly, brushing soil from his gloves. Emily shook her head and stepped closer. "Are you Joe?" she asked. He rose slowly, his knees cracking with the effort. "Depends who's asking." She hesitated, then held out the photograph. "I'm looking for answers, about him and the dog." Joe took the picture carefully. At first his brow furrowed in concentration, but then his expression softened into something almost like grief. He let out a long breath. "I haven't seen this photo in years," he said quietly. "That's Nathan, and that's Buddy, loyal as the day is long." "You remember them?" Emily asked. Joe nodded. "I do. I was there the night the fire broke out. I pulled kids out from the dormitories. Smoke thick as tar, screams echoing in the halls. It was chaos. We lost power within minutes." He paused, eyes distant. "We thought we got everyone out. But then someone yelled that a boy had gone back inside, said he wouldn't leave without his dog or his sister." Emily's breath caught. "We found the dog's bed in the wreckage," Joe continued. "Charred. No sign of the dog or the boy. And the girl, well, no one even knew where she ended up. It was like she vanished." He looked back at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you asking about them now? After all this time?" Emily took a deep breath. "Because I think I might be the girl." Joe's face didn't change right away, but something in his posture stiffened. He gestured to a nearby bench. "Sit down. Tell me everything." So she did. She told him about finding the photo, about the way Buddy's eyes seemed to speak to her, about Ms. Helen's memories and the mysterious feeling in her chest she couldn't shake. She explained how she had no memory before the age of 6, how her file at the orphanage only dated back 8 years, how she'd been transferred from another institution, but no one ever talked about why. When she finished, there was a long silence between them. Joe finally nodded slowly. "That would explain a lot. We always thought the girl must have been taken in somewhere else, but without names or records, she just slipped through the cracks." "But why didn't anyone connect me to them?" Emily asked, frustrated. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Joe leaned back, hands resting on his thighs. "Because sometimes the system doesn't work like it should. Files get misplaced, names get changed, and when you're a kid without answers, People tend to fill in the blanks with silence. Emily looked down at the photo in her lap. I didn't remember anything, she murmured. Not Nathan, not Buddy, nothing. That's not your fault, Joe said gently. Trauma can bury memories deep, but they don't stay buried forever. That picture, it must have woken something up inside you. She nodded slowly. I think so. I don't remember much. Just flashes. A boy's laughter. A warm body curled at my feet. A silver collar that jingled when I walked. She looked up, eyes full of quiet determination. I have to find them. Both of them. Nathan and Buddy. Joe gave her a long, appraising look. You've got his spirit, I'll give you that. Emily tilted her head. Whose? Nathan's, he said, smiling sadly. He'd walk through fire for the ones he loved. Looks like you might too. She smiled, but it wavered at the edges. Do you think he could still be alive? Joe didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a faded folder from his canvas bag and handed it to her. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the area around Rosefield, with markings from the night of the fire, routes taken, locations searched, spots marked uncleared. There was never any confirmation of his death, Joe said, and as for that dog, Buddy was something else. If anyone could have made it out and kept a child safe, it was him. Emily clutched the folder to her chest. Then I have to keep looking. Joe nodded. Start here. The woods past the river were never fully searched. Too thick, too remote. If there's any chance, it'll be out there. She stood and offered her hand. Thank you, Joe. He shook it with surprising strength. You bring that dog home, Emily. And your brother, too. That night, Emily returned to Rosefield different. Changed. The photo of Buddy and Nathan no longer felt like a mystery from someone else's life. It felt like a missing piece of her own. And now that she had a direction, she wasn't stopping until she found the rest of the story. The days following her conversation with Joe passed in a blur. Emily spent every free moment poring over the folder he had given her, rereading the reports, and tracing the map with her fingertips. But her attention always circled back to one small detail she had almost missed, something barely visible in the photograph of Buddy. Around the pitbull's neck was a collar, metal, worn with age. On its tag, right beneath the name Buddy, was a faint, almost imperceptible series of numbers etched beside a feathered wing emblem. It looked like some kind of registration code. Emily showed it to Ms. Helen, who leaned in closer, squinting at the mark. That, Ms. Helen whispered, might be a kennel registry. Some rescue organizations use markings like that. Together, they turned to the internet, scanning through old shelter databases and contacting rescue centers in neighboring counties. Hours turned into days. Most leads went nowhere. But then Ms. Helen paused at one result. An old pitbull rescue center listed in an adjacent county, one that had been active around the time of the fire. It's called Haven Hills, she said. They shut down years ago, but their intake records were donated to a regional shelter network. We might still find something. Emily's heart leapt. The name on the record matched. Buddy. Intake year, the same year as the fire. Breed, American Pitbull Terrier. Color, silver gray. They had found him, or at least they had found where he might have gone. When Emily brought the information to the orphanage's management, they were skeptical at first. It wasn't common for one of their kids to be handed this much freedom, let alone on what sounded like an emotional hunch. But Ms. Helen stood beside her, unwavering. She has the right to find out where she came from, the older woman said firmly, and I'll be with her every step of the way. After some deliberation, and under the condition that Ms. Helen would remain with her throughout the trip, the orphanage gave its reluctant approval. So, on a cool morning heavy with mist, the two of them set out in Helen's weathered Subaru, a folder of maps and photocopied records sitting between them on the passenger seat. The drive took them through winding country roads, past farmlands and sleepy towns. Neither spoke much. The air was thick with anticipation and quiet hope. When they arrived at the shelter that now managed Haven Hill's old files, a young man named Alex greeted them at the gate. He was lean, with soft eyes and a calm presence. When Emily explained why she was there, showing him the photograph and the matching registry number, something shifted in his expression. "I think I know who you're talking about," he said quietly. "He's been here a long time. Came in through Haven Hill's transfer before they shut down. He's old now. Real old. Doesn't get up much anymore." Emily's throat tightened. "Can I see him?" Alex nodded and led them through the grounds, past several outdoor pens where younger dogs played or napped in the sun. Finally, they reached a quieter area in the back, where the elderly dogs were kept, those unlikely to be adopted but too loved to be forgotten. The pen was small, shaded, with a soft blanket and a bowl of water beside the fence. In the farthest corner, a large pitbull lay curled up, his body stiff with age. His fur had faded to nearly white in places, and his eyes were clouded with age, but something in the way his ears twitched, attuned, aware, made Emily's breath catch. Alex stepped back. "He doesn't respond much anymore," he said gently. "Doesn't trust many people." But Emily had already taken a slow step forward. She knelt outside the pen, not saying a word. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph, the same one she'd carried since the beginning. Carefully, she held it up so the dog could see. For a long moment, nothing happened. The old pit bull didn't lift his head, didn't move. Emily's heart sank. But then, he sniffed. It was barely a motion, more breath than movement, but it was enough. The dog's nostrils flared, his ears perked just a bit, and then, slowly, achingly, he began to rise. First the head, then the body, every joint stiff, every muscle hesitant. His paws shuffled forward, cautious. When he reached the edge of the fence, he lowered his head and sniffed again. Emily was frozen, tears threatening to spill. "Buddy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The old pit bull's ears perked again. He stepped forward one last time and pressed his nose through the fence, right into her open palm. His tail gave a single, tired wag. And Emily broke. She let the tears fall as she leaned her forehead against the wire, whispering his name again and again. There were no words exchanged, no dramatic gestures, just that quiet connection, solid as stone and fragile as breath. Two souls recognizing each other beyond time, beyond memory. Behind her, Ms. Helen wiped at her eyes. Even Alex looked stunned. "I've never seen him like this," he said softly. "It's like he's home." Emily stayed by Buddy's side for what felt like hours. She didn't need answers in that moment. She didn't need explanations. All she needed was that feeling, that undeniable certainty in her chest that she had found him. Buddy remembered, and that changed everything. The morning after reuniting with Buddy, Emily sat with Ms. Helen on the wooden bench outside the shelter, the old pit bull sleeping peacefully at her feet. His breathing was slow and steady, his large gray head resting on her shoe like a child clinging to a favorite toy. Emily had barely slept the night before. Her mind had been racing, not with questions, but with possibility. She felt something shifting inside her, as if the world was no longer holding its breath. Something was unfolding. As the sunlight filtered through the trees, Alex came out holding a worn notebook. "You should see this," he said, flipping through pages before handing it over. "It's from our intake archives. We keep records on anyone who ever came looking for the older dogs, especially the long-term stays. Sometimes people change their minds and come back years later." Emily accepted the notebook with care. Her eyes scanned the familiar details: intake date, breed, physical condition. Then her breath caught at a scribbled note near the bottom. "Visited by Nate, Mid-20s, scar on left forehead. Asked for Buddy, believed dog may be his from childhood, left callback number and address. No follow-up. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she showed it to Ms. Helen. Nate, she murmured. That has to be Nathan. Ms. Helen leaned in to read. This was dated 3 years ago. He came all this way looking for Buddy, and never came back. Why wouldn't he return? Emily wondered aloud. Unless he didn't remember enough, or thought Buddy didn't recognize him. Or maybe, Ms. Helen added gently, he didn't know anyone was still looking for him. They didn't wait. By midday, they had packed the car again, Buddy nestled in the back seat with blankets and a soft cushion. He slept the whole way, snoring lightly, but every so often his tail would flick as if he sensed the importance of the journey. The address led them to a remote town nestled in the hills. Green Hollow, a quiet place surrounded by forest and wide, open fields. On the outskirts stood a modest stretch of fenced property. The sign out front read, Second Chance K-9 Training, Pitbull's Welcome. A mix of anxiety and hope rose in Emily's throat. She hadn't even met Nathan yet, but her heart beat with a kind of anticipation only family could trigger. They pulled into the gravel driveway. A few dogs barked in the distance, but the area was calm. There was a barn, a small house, and an open training field with agility structures made of wood and tires. A man stepped out of the barn. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially shadowed by a baseball cap. Even from afar, Emily noticed the scar across his left temple. Ms. Helen got out first. "Are you Nate?" she called. The man paused, eyeing them cautiously. "Yeah," he replied, his voice low. "Can I help you?" Emily stepped forward, her pulse thudding in her ears. I think you knew a dog named Buddy. You came to find him once?" "At Haven Hills," Nate stiffened. "That was a long time ago," he said slowly. "Why are you asking?" Emily opened the back door. Buddy, as if sensing the moment, raised his head. It took effort, but the old pitbull shifted forward, his cloudy eyes locking onto Nate, and then it happened. With a sudden jolt of energy that seemed impossible for his age, Buddy launched himself out of the car and stumbled forward. His legs were shaky, but his body surged with emotion. He barked, loud and hoarse, once, then again. Nate took a step back, stunned. "Buddy," he whispered. The dog didn't hesitate. He reached Nate and buried his face against the man's chest, whining, tail wagging furiously. Nate fell to his knees, arms wrapping instinctively around the pit bull's thick neck. "Oh my God," he breathed, voice breaking. "I thought I'd imagined you." He held Buddy close, eyes shut tight, until tears slipped down his face. Emily stood frozen, her heart aching. She had never seen such raw recognition. And then Nathan looked up at her, really looked. Something clicked. He stared for a long moment, confusion rippling through his features. "Wait! I know you." Emily stepped closer. Her voice trembled. "It's me, Nathan. It's Emily, your sister." He blinked hard as if shaking off a fog. "No, Emily was—" He broke off, staring again, piecing together memories that had been buried for nearly a decade. He reached up, touching the side of his head near the scar. "I hit my head. In the fire. I couldn't remember. I thought maybe I had a sister, but no one ever came. I thought maybe it was all a dream." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks. She crouched beside Buddy and took Nathan's hand. "I didn't remember either. Not until I saw the photo of you and Buddy. That photo brought everything back." Nathan choked on a laugh and a sob at the same time. "You found Buddy. After all these years, you brought him back." "No," Emily said softly. "He brought me to you." The three of them stayed there in the dirt for a long time. Nathan with his arms around Buddy, Emily beside them both. The wind moved gently through the trees, as if the world itself was exhaling. For the first time since the fire, since the day everything changed, brother and sister were together again, and Buddy, faithful Buddy, was right where he was always meant to be. The sky above Green Hollow was soft with the hues of a setting sun, gold fading into amber, brushing the horizon with gentle light as the day began its slow descent into evening. The training field at Second Chance K9 had grown still. Even the normally energetic dogs in the nearby pens had gone quiet, as if sensing that something sacred was unfolding on the grounds they called home. Emily sat on the ground beside Nathan, both of them wrapped in a silence so full it seemed to speak. They hadn't let go of each other since the moment they'd recognized who they truly were. The years of separation had vanished in a single, aching heartbeat, replaced by a truth that could no longer be denied. They were family. Always had been. Even when the world had tried to erase that from their memories. Between them, resting like a sentinel, was Buddy. The old pitbull lay curled up, his gray head nestled right where Emily's knee met Nathan's thigh. His breathing was slow but steady, the rise and fall of his chest like the rhythm of a lullaby only they could hear. His clouded eyes remained closed, but every now and then his ears would twitch, his tail giving a tired thump against the dirt, small signs that he knew he was safe. He was home. Nathan ran a hand down the dog's back, fingers trailing through fur that had once been sleek silver and now shimmered white like aged snow. "He waited," he said, his voice low, thick with emotion. "All this time he waited." Emily nodded, tears still drying on her cheeks. "He remembered everything, even when we couldn't." They had cried, both of them, when the flood of memories came rushing back, of summer nights spent playing in the fields behind the orphanage, of Buddy curling at the foot of their shared bed, of Nathan promising to never leave Emily's side. They remembered the fire, too, at least pieces of it. The confusion, the smoke, the heat, the screams. Nathan remembered running back into the building when he realized Emily wasn't behind him. He remembered Buddy at his side, barking wildly, refusing to leave without her, and then darkness. A falling beam, the sound of glass shattering, silence. "I woke up in a clinic 2 counties over," Nathan told her earlier, sitting on a wooden step outside the barn. "They told me I had a head injury. I didn't remember who I was at first. Just flashes. A dog, a little girl, a promise. I tried to ask, but no one knew where I'd come from, so I started over. New name, new life." Emily had listened, her heart breaking with every word. "And I kept dreaming about him," Nathan added, glancing at Buddy. "About the way he looked at me. I knew if I ever found him again, maybe I'd find myself too." And now here they were, together, whole. Buddy stirred gently beneath Nathan's hand and let out a soft sigh. Emily leaned down and pressed her forehead to his. "You brought me back," she whispered. "You never gave up." There was something deeply poetic about it. How a dog, cast aside by many as dangerous because of his breed, had proven to be the most loyal, loving creature either of them had ever known. Buddy hadn't just survived the fire, he had survived the years that followed, the confusion, the loneliness. And when Emily had finally come searching, it was as if he'd been waiting for her all along. Word of their reunion spread quickly through the small town. A local reporter, tipped off by a staff member at the shelter, asked if they could share the story. Nathan hesitated at first. He had lived quietly for so long, but Emily convinced him that people needed to hear about Buddy, about what loyalty really meant, about what love could survive. The article was published in the Green Hollow Gazette under the headline, "A Dog's Promise Pitbull Reunites Long-Lost Siblings After 8 Years." Photos of the 3 of them, Emily, Nathan, and Buddy, standing together in the training field were shared online, and the story touched thousands across the country. But for the siblings, the fame didn't matter. All that mattered was that they had each other again. The orphanage approved Emily's request to move in with Nathan after a thorough background check and a few days of paperwork. Ms. Helen accompanied her back to Rosefield one last time to pack her things, and when they returned to Green Hollow, it was with a sense of closure neither of them had known they needed. Ms. Helen hugged Emily tightly before leaving and whispered, "He was always meant to bring you home." Nathan converted a small room in the farmhouse into a bedroom for Emily. He painted the walls her favorite color, sky blue, and even built her a bookshelf for her growing collection of dog training manuals and journals. Emily had already decided she wanted to work with animals when she grew up, and Nathan promised to teach her everything he knew. Buddy had his own spot, too. Nathan moved his dog bed into the living room beside the fireplace and placed a soft blanket over it, though the old pitbull seemed to prefer falling asleep at their feet. He followed them around the house during the day, slowly but contentedly, and each night he curled up beside their chairs like a silent guardian. His health was declining. Everyone could see that. But there was no sadness in the way he lived, only peace, a deep, undeniable peace that came from having fulfilled a promise he'd never forgotten. Sometimes Emily would catch Nathan just watching Buddy, his eyes misty. "He's not just a dog," he said once. "He's the reason we're here." And he was right. In the quiet moments, the early mornings with coffee on the porch, the evenings spent walking the fields, the late-night talks by firelight, there was a new rhythm to their lives, one not built from survival, but from healing. One evening, Emily sat cross-legged beside Buddy, running her fingers through his fur. "You're my hero," she said softly. "Not because you saved us, but because you never stopped believing we'd find each other again." Buddy didn't move much these days, but when she said that, he lifted his head just slightly, and his eyes met hers. It was only for a moment, but in that look was everything: memory, love, and the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed. The world hadn't made it easy. Time, distance, pain, and lost memories had tried to separate them. But through it all, one old pitbull had remembered, had waited, had kept his heart tethered to theirs like a compass pointing home, and in the end, it was his loyalty that brought them back to where they belonged. Together. The sun had begun to dip below the hills of Green Hollow, casting a warm, golden hue through the windows of the farmhouse. Inside the living room, Emily sat curled up in the armchair beside the fireplace, a soft wool blanket draped across her legs, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. Resting on her lap was a worn leather journal, the corners frayed from use, and on the front cover, neatly inscribed in her handwriting, were the words, "The Dog Who Never Forgot." She paused for a moment, her fingers trailing over the title, then opened to the final page. The last sentence had just been written. And in the end, she had penned, "He wasn't just our dog. He was our memory keeper, our silent compass, the one who carried our hearts when we forgot who we were." She let out a soft breath and closed the journal. It had taken months to write. At first, it started as a simple reflection, something she did at night to sort through the rush of emotions that came after reuniting with Buddy and Nathan. But as the memories surfaced more clearly and the story took shape, Emily realized it wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who had ever lost something precious, who had ever doubted the strength of loyalty, or questioned if broken families could be whole again. Buddy's story was more than a tale of survival. It was a legacy. Since moving in with Nathan, life had taken on a new rhythm. Emily had enrolled in a local program that focused on animal welfare and behavior. She spent her mornings shadowing Nathan as he trained dogs, many of them pit bulls with stories just as complex as Buddy's, and her afternoons studying animal psychology and rescue rehabilitation. She had found her calling, and it pulsed through her with quiet purpose. "I want to change the way people see dogs like Buddy," she told Nathan one evening as they sat on the porch. They think pit bulls are dangerous or untrustworthy, but Buddy, he saved us. He remembered what we forgot. That's not danger. That's devotion. Nathan had smiled, pride shining through his eyes. You're giving him more than just a second life, Em. You're giving him a future. They had even started a small outreach program, inviting local kids and families to meet the rescue dogs and learn about responsible ownership, compassion, and breed awareness. Emily spoke openly about Buddy, showing children how powerful and gentle pit bulls could be. She shared the story of the fire, the photo, and how one dog's love stitched back together a family torn apart by tragedy. And through it all, Buddy remained by her side. Though his steps were slower now and his naps longer, he was still very much present. He followed her from room to room, settled by her feet during writing sessions, and gently nudged her hand when he sensed she needed a break. He was her constant, her reminder of where she had come from and how far she had traveled to find her way home. One quiet afternoon, Emily stood in the living room staring at the wall above the fireplace. There, side by side in matching wooden frames, hung two photographs. The first was old and slightly faded, a black and white snapshot of a little boy with a gap-toothed grin holding a silver-coated pit bull puppy, both of them beaming under a summer sun. Nathan and Buddy, before everything. The second was in full color, warm light spilling across the field behind the house. Emily stood beside Nathan, both of them laughing, Buddy between them, head slightly bowed as if he understood the moment. That picture had been taken just a week after their reunion, under a golden sky that seemed to wrap them all in its arms. Two photos, one lifetime, and a dog who never forgot. Sometimes Emily would sit in front of those photos for hours, remembering details that never made it into the journal. Like the first time Buddy barked protectively when a stranger approached her, or how he would press his nose into Nathan's hand at night, grounding him through bad dreams, or how during thunderstorms he would curl up close to her bed, a living shield against the world. He had been their protector, their guide, their healer. And as time wore on, Emily knew that his time with them was growing shorter. But there was no fear in her heart, only peace. He's not going anywhere, Nathan had said one evening when he saw the worry in her eyes. Even when he's not here, he'll still be in this house. In us, Emily had nodded, and in her journal she had written those words again and again. She often sat beside Buddy and read passages to him, even if he was too tired to open his eyes. His tail would twitch when she said his name, or when she read about the day they found each other again. Sometimes she would rest her head on his side and just listen to his heartbeat, slow, steady, comforting. On the night she finished her journal, she sat outside under a sky full of stars. Buddy lay beside her, curled into a soft blanket. She placed the journal on the porch beside them and whispered, "We're going to help more dogs like you. We're going to tell your story to the world." His ears twitched, and she smiled. Because no matter what came next, the legacy of Buddy would live on, not just in pages or pictures, but in every dog Emily helped, every heart she touched, and every child who learned that loyalty can outlast even the fiercest storm. As the crickets began their nightly chorus and the wind rustled through the trees, Emily looked down at the dog who had brought her home. His eyes were closed, his breathing even. "You kept your promise," she said softly, "and now it's my turn." Inside, the warm glow from the living room spilled out onto the porch, touching the edge of her journal, catching the corner of a silver photo frame that reflected a life rebuilt. The girl, the boy, and the dog, no longer lost. Home, at last. As the sun set behind the hills of Green Hollow, a brother, a sister, and an aging pit bull sat in the golden light, not as survivors, but as a family made whole again. A dog is the only thing on earth that loves you more than he loves himself. Josh Billings. Buddy's journey is a lesson for us all. Even when the world forgets you, love remembers. If this story touched you, leave a comment below and share what part spoke to your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to Veil Marks. Your support helps us craft more meaningful, emotional stories that matter. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. It would be the greatest encouragement for our storytelling journey. Because here, every story leaves a mark.